It was one of those Kentucky summers that seemed to settle directly onto the skin. The humidity in Ashland was thick and unmoving, carrying the sweetness of honeysuckle and the faint metallic scent drifting in from the Ohio River. By late July of 1987, the town appeared caught between its familiar past and an uncertain future. It was still small enough for neighbors to recognize one another, yet restless enough for many families to dream of leaving. For four local boys, that summer was supposed to be memorable for an entirely different reason. They believed they were about to share one final adventure before life separated them. None of them could have known that their disappearance would become a mystery that followed Ashland for almost 3 decades. Tommy Hensley was 13, the oldest and boldest member of the group. He was the kind of boy who suggested dangerous dares with a confident smile, making the others feel as though refusing was impossible. Jake Porter, who was 12, was quieter and more cautious. He usually considered the risks before acting, but his loyalty to his friends always pulled him forward. Mark Dalton helped keep the group balanced. He was calm, dependable, and practical, often stepping in when Tommy's enthusiasm became reckless. Ricky Cole was the youngest at 11. He followed the other 3 wherever they went, usually a few steps behind, smiling as though every invitation from them was an honor. That particular summer carried a sense of finality. Tommy's father had lost his position at the steel mill, and the Hensley family was preparing to relocate to Lexington. Mark's father had accepted a new job in Ohio, meaning his family would also be leaving Ashland. The boys understood that their ordinary days together were disappearing. Soon there would be no more afternoons riding bicycles beside the creek, no more exploring the tree-covered hills, and no more secret plans made beneath the summer sun. They began referring to their upcoming journey as their last great adventure. On the morning of July 23rd, neighbors saw the boys gathered in the Hensley driveway. They were filling small backpacks with snack cakes, water, a flashlight, and what appeared to be a compass borrowed from one of their father's fishing supplies. By midday, several residents noticed them cycling along Route 3. Sweat darkened their shirts, and waves of heat rose from the road beneath their tires. They seemed excited and completely unconcerned for friends heading toward the hills on a bright summer afternoon. The final confirmed sighting occurred at approximately 5 o'clock near the entrance to the old Colton Fire Tower Trail. A man walking his dog remembered seeing the boys and lifting one hand in greeting. They waved back before continuing down the path. At the time, it seemed like an ordinary exchange, the kind of moment no one would normally remember. It only became significant because everything that followed went terribly wrong. When evening arrived and the boys had not returned, their parents were not immediately alarmed. The friends had camped beside the creek before, sometimes staying out later than expected. Their families assumed they had decided to spend the night outdoors without asking permission. By midnight, that assumption had begun to feel less believable. Telephone calls were made between the 4 homes. Porch lights came on, and worried parents walked into their yards with flashlights. By 2 in the morning, relatives and neighbors were driving along the back roads, lowering their windows, and shouting the boys' names into the darkness. The surrounding woodland, once familiar and harmless, suddenly appeared endless. At sunrise, the Boyd County Sheriff's Office became involved. Search teams entered the forest near Black Run Creek, following deer paths and narrow trails the boys were known to explore. Not far from the water, searchers discovered several small footprints grouped closely together. The tracks appeared to move downhill toward the creek. Then they ended. The impressions disappeared in an area of wet mud, leaving no clear indication of where the boys had gone next. Tracking dogs were brought to the scene, helicopters passed over the forest, and hundreds of volunteers began searching the valleys, slopes, and stream beds. For days, every sound created a moment of hope. A breaking branch caused searchers to turn. A distant splash sent people running toward the water. A shape moving behind the trees made hearts race. Each time, they found nothing. When the first week ended without a meaningful discovery, hope began to give way to dread. The families established a temporary camp near the trail entrance. The boys' mothers sat together through the nights, exhausted and pale, while their fathers stared into the trees or walked silently around the command area. Inside the sheriff's office, investigators covered a wall with a large map. Every completed search area was marked, along with every reported sighting and every clue that had led nowhere. One dog handler reported an unusual reaction near an old gully beside the creek. The dogs became agitated, barking and pulling toward the slope. Then, without warning, they stopped. They refused to advance, backing away from the area as though frightened or confused. The gully became a major focus of the operation. Searchers examined the mud, rocks, fallen trees, and surrounding vegetation. Yet they found no bicycles, clothing, backpacks, or other personal belongings. There was only disturbed soil and a faint, unpleasant smell that local residents claimed came naturally from decaying material in the creek bed. By the 10th day, different theories had started dividing the community. Some people believed the boys had wandered off the trail, become disoriented, and died from exposure to the extreme heat. Others revived an old local story about a solitary man who supposedly lived deep in the hills. Parents had told versions of that tale for years to frighten children away from abandoned mining areas. Now some residents wondered whether the story might contain a piece of truth. Other rumors were even darker. A few people suggested that one of the boys had intentionally taken the group somewhere forbidden. Others believed they might have witnessed something they were never supposed to see. Throughout it all, Ashland seemed to hold its breath. Families kept their children indoors. Bicycles disappeared from neighborhood roads. The woods that had served as a playground for generations became a place people avoided. Residents began calling the area the Colton Woods Curse. Some used the name jokingly, but their nervous expressions revealed that the fear behind it was real. The most disturbing part of the case was not simply that 4 children had disappeared. It was the complete absence of evidence. They had entered the woods together and seemed to have vanished without leaving behind a bicycle, bag, item of clothing, or reliable trail. It was as though the ground itself had opened and taken them. By the end of August, officials suspended the full search. Heavy rainfall had caused the creek to overflow twice, destroying much of the remaining evidence. News crews departed, volunteers returned to their jobs, and the missing person posters taped to telephone poles and fuel pumps began fading beneath the sun. For the families, however, the search never truly ended. Tommy's mother, Linda, preserved his bedroom exactly as he had left it. Jake's parents kept his bicycle leaning near the porch for months, unable to move it because doing so felt like accepting that he would never ride home. Years later, Ashland residents still reported seeing Linda walking near the ridgeline with a flashlight after midnight, calling her son's name into the trees. The disappearance gradually became more than an unsolved investigation. It became a wound the town learned to carry. Children born years later grew up knowing the names Tommy Hensley, Jake Porter, Mark Dalton, and Ricky Cole. They were warned never to approach the old Fire Tower Trail after sunset. The boys had wanted one final summer, one final bicycle ride, and one adventure they would remember after moving away. Instead, the forest erased their path, and Ashland was left with a goodbye that never seemed to end. For the first several days of the search, most residents refused to believe the boys could truly be gone. For children, disappearing only a few miles from their homes seemed impossible. The woods were filled with activity. Police radios crackled constantly. Trucks moved along the dirt roads, and helicopters circled overhead, their blades cutting through the heavy summer air. The Boyd County Sheriff's Office transformed the Colton Fire Tower Trail into the center of the largest search operation the county had ever organized. Deputies worked beside firefighters, state police officers, emergency personnel, and civilian volunteers. Members of the National Guard also participated, flying over the forest canopy and scanning for movement, smoke, brightly colored clothing, or anything else that might reveal the boys' location. Every morning began before sunrise. Searchers gathered for roll call, studied maps while drinking coffee, and listened as team leaders assigned new sections of terrain. Then they entered the woods in carefully spaced lines, moving shoulder to shoulder through thick vegetation. Their boots sank into wet soil, and the air beneath the trees smelled of pine, mud, and decaying leaves. Every few minutes, someone shouted one of the boys' names. For a brief moment, everyone stopped and listened. The only response was an echo. The families remained at the command site around the clock. They established tents near the fire tower and waited for the moment when the boys might emerge from the woods. The mothers sat in folding chairs, gripping cups of coffee they rarely drank. The fathers paced short distances, spoke quietly with investigators, and avoided looking at one another for too long. Ashland rallied around them. Churches organized meal deliveries. Restaurants sent food to the volunteers. Residents from neighboring counties arrived with flashlights, rain jackets, medical supplies, and offers to help. For a short time, the entire region appeared united by a single fragile belief. Somewhere in those hills, the 4 friends were still alive and waiting to be found. That belief became harder to maintain with each passing day. By the end of the first week, exhaustion was visible everywhere. The dogs were overworked, searchers had blisters on their feet, and many volunteers could barely walk after spending long days climbing the steep terrain. Then a powerful storm moved across the county. Rain fell heavily for hours, pushing creeks over their banks and turning familiar trails into streams of fast-moving mud. Search grids that had taken days to complete were damaged overnight. Low clouds prevented helicopters from flying, and radio communication became unreliable in the valleys. The few clues investigators had located, including footprints and broken vegetation, were washed away. When the weather finally cleared, parts of the forest looked completely different. Paths had disappeared, new channels had formed in the soil, and fallen branches covered the ground. That was when uneasiness began replacing optimism. Harold Vickers, an experienced sheriff's deputy involved in leading the search teams, later described the forest after the storm as strangely empty. He said the place felt quieter, almost as though the boys had never entered it. Several volunteers reported hearing sounds they could not explain. Some believed they heard children laughing somewhere beyond the trees, only for the sound to fade whenever they moved toward it. Others described seeing brief shadows or movement at the edge of their vision. Most investigators blamed fatigue, fear, and the confusing way sound traveled through the hills. Still, the reports added to the growing sense that something about the woods was deeply wrong. 3 days after the storm, a volunteer searching near Black Run Creek discovered a torn strip of nylon partly buried in the mud. A short distance away, another person found what looked like a backpack strap. There's also a faint shoe impression that appeared too small to belong to an adult. Between two rocks, searchers recovered an old flashlight coated in dirt and rust. The objects immediately renewed hope. Investigators photographed the area, sealed each item in an evidence bag, and sent everything for laboratory examination. The testing produced no clear connection to the missing boys. The nylon could not be identified, the shoe impression was too damaged for comparison, and the flashlight had been outdoors for an unknown period. The disappointment was crushing, but the families continued waiting. Every rumor became a possible breakthrough. One caller claimed to have seen 4 boys at a fuel station approximately 30 miles south of Ashland. Another person reported hearing a young voice near abandoned mine entrances after dark. Deputies rushed to each location, sometimes traveling through the night with sirens echoing along isolated roads. They searched empty fields, old buildings, drainage tunnels, and mining shafts. None of the reports produced evidence. During the second week, reporters from Louisville and Lexington filled the local motels and established camera positions near the command post. The disappearance of the 4 Boyd County boys became the leading story on evening broadcasts across Kentucky. Letters arrived from people throughout the state. Some offered sympathy, while others contained theories, claimed visions, or suspicious information that investigators could not verify. Beneath the public support, Ashland was beginning to fracture. Residents accused the sheriff's office of searching the wrong areas. Others questioned why the families had allowed the boys to travel so far alone. Cruel rumors suggested parental neglect or secret problems inside the homes. People who had prepared meals together only days earlier began arguing over what might have happened. The story about the supposed hermit returned with new details. Some said he was a former miner who had become unstable after the mines closed. Others claimed to have noticed smoke rising from a hidden cabin. Deputy Vickers personally searched miles of terrain considered difficult or unsafe. During one expedition, he found an abandoned mining road almost completely covered by thorny plants. It led to a collapsed shaft that smelled strongly of damp soil. Investigators lowered cameras through a narrow opening, but the images revealed no evidence of the boys. After 3 weeks, exhaustion became as serious an obstacle as the forest itself. Volunteers began returning home. Food donations decreased, and the once crowded command area became quieter. There were no fresh clues and no clear direction for investigators to follow. By late August, only family members, close friends, and a small number of officers remained near the trail. They stood together as the sheriff announced that the search would be reduced. The official explanation was painful but practical. Too much time had passed. If the children remained outdoors, the severe heat, repeated storms, and lack of food or clean water would have made survival unlikely. Authorities adopted the theory that the boys had become lost, traveled deeper into the forest, and possibly fallen into a ravine or hidden natural formation. Nature, they believed, had concealed the evidence. Many residents were not convinced. Hunters spoke of unexplained lights moving through the hills after midnight. Some claim to have discovered recent-looking campsites containing cigarette ends and burned animal remains. Others insisted the boys had been abducted. A darker theory suggested that the friends had accidentally discovered an illegal activity hidden in the forest and had been silenced by someone who knew the area. Without evidence, every possibility seemed both believable and impossible. The community that had once searched with a single purpose began separating under the weight of uncertainty. Parents warned their children never to enter the woods. The Fire Tower Trail was closed without ceremony. By early September, the tents had disappeared. The missing posters remained, but their paper had faded and curled. For the first time since the boys vanished, the woods became quiet again. To those who had participated in the search, that silence no longer felt peaceful. Harold Vickers continued returning to the area long after the official operation ended. Sometimes he parked near the trail entrance and remained inside his truck for hours, staring at the trees. He once told a reporter that when the wind moved across the ridges, he could almost hear the searchers calling the boys' names. It seemed to him that the forest remembered what had happened but refused to reveal it. Ashland attempted to resume ordinary life, yet reminders remained everywhere. They appeared in empty seats at school, faded photographs in shop windows, and the way parents held their children more tightly when driving past the old trail. Every summer, when the heat returned and cicadas filled the trees with noise, the town remembered the 4 bicycles heading toward the hills. The search had ended, but the questions had not. Somewhere beyond the areas reached by volunteers, aircraft, dogs, and flashlights, the truth remained hidden beneath years of leaves, soil, rain, and silence. As time passed, Ashland tried to soften the pain left by the disappearance. It never completely succeeded. The 1990s arrived and disappeared, bringing new businesses, new homes, and families who knew little about the original search. The town changed, but the forest beyond it remained deep, quiet, and difficult to reach. For younger residents, the 4 missing boys became part of local folklore. They had not witnessed the helicopters, the search camps, or the exhausted parents waiting beside the trail. They knew only the stories repeated by older brothers, parents, and classmates. Teenagers claimed that laughter could still be heard near the ridge on calm nights. Others said unseen footsteps followed anyone who entered the woods after dark. The Colton Trail entrance became a place where young people tested their courage. Groups rode bicycles or drove there at night, shone flashlights between the trees, and challenged one another to remain alone for several minutes. Most laughed about it afterward, but few stayed long. The original wooden sign directing hikers toward the fire tower slowly decayed. It leaned into the weeds, its painted letters almost erased by rain and sun. For the families, however, time had erased nothing. Every July, the anniversary returned with the same oppressive heat and the same memories. Linda Hensley never allowed the date to pass unnoticed. She drove an aging pickup along the gravel road where the search camp had once stood. When the road became too narrow, she parked and continued on foot. Linda always carried a small bag. Inside were 4 toy soldiers, one representing each boy. An old tree stump near the ridge. She placed them in a row, knelt beside them, and whispered words no one else could hear. Then she remained there until the daylight began disappearing. Residents became accustomed to seeing her sitting alone in the grass. They respected her privacy, understanding that the ritual was one of the few ways she could remain connected to her son. The other families responded to the loss differently. Jake's father eventually left Kentucky. Mark's older brother joined the military and rarely returned to Ashland except for family funerals. Ricky's parents separated and quietly sold their home on the eastern side of town. The disappearance seemed to have stretched each family in a different direction until the bonds holding them together could no longer withstand the strain. The investigation records were packed into boxes at the county sheriff's office. They contained witness statements, photographs, maps, laboratory reports, handwritten notes, and hundreds of tips that had produced no answer. The boxes collected dust, but Harold Vickers could not forget them. By then, Vickers had retired from law enforcement. The case, however, remained lodged in his mind like a splinter he could never remove. He had spent years reconsidering the search routes and reading the original witness statements. In his garage, he created what his wife called his second office. A workbench disappeared beneath topographic maps, photocopied reports, handwritten calculations, and photographs connected by strips of tape. Vickers had developed a theory. He no longer believed the boys had vanished near the main Colton search area. He believed they had continued south, moving beyond the sections that investigators had thoroughly examined. According to him, The boys might have entered the outer boundary of the Daniel Boone National Forest, traveling much farther than anyone expected. He spent weekends walking remote ridges and following creek beds. He compared modern terrain with maps printed during the 1980s, looking for trails that had shifted, disappeared, or been marked incorrectly. Vickers frequently returned home covered in mud, carrying rusted metal, unusual stones, or pieces of wood he believed might have belonged to old trail markers. His wife did not share his certainty, but she never demanded that he stop. Everyone in Ashland had found a different way to live with the disappearance. Searching was Vickers's way. By the middle of the 2000s, much of the Colton woodland had become part of a restricted wildlife zone. Fences blocked several routes, and the abandoned fire tower had collapsed, its metal frames slowly sinking into the ground. Even as the forest reclaimed the area, stories continued circulating. Campers reported finding initials cut into old trees, although weathering made the letters impossible to identify. Other hikers described an isolated clearing that contained signs of a crude shelter. Most discoveries were dismissed as unrelated, but each report revived interest for a few days. Then, in 2008, an unexpected event brought the case back into public attention. A college student in Tennessee purchased a container of surplus property through an online auction. The description listed miscellaneous items recovered from police storage. It offered no names or case information, only an inventory number. Inside the container were faded photographs, old notebooks, damaged documents, and a small canvas backpack. The bag was badly weathered. Part of the fabric had torn, and the metal pieces showed signs of corrosion. On one strap, someone had carved two faint initials. They appeared to be the letters T and H. The buyer initially considered the backpack ordinary discarded property. Later, he uploaded a photograph to an internet forum where people discussed historical missing person cases. A user studying the image noticed a reference number printed on the inside label. After comparing it with archived information, the user believed the digits matched an evidence entry connected to the Hensley investigation. Within days, the photograph reached Ashland. The sheriff's department confirmed that the backpack appeared to be an item entered into evidence during the original investigation in 1987. Officials had believed it was missing, misplaced, or transferred incorrectly during decades of storage changes. The discovery seemed to make the entire town inhale again. Reporters returned. Investigators reopened boxes that had not been examined in years. Family members who had stopped expecting answers allowed themselves to hope once more. The backpack was delivered to a state laboratory. Technicians found soil particles, fragments of decayed paper, and a corroded zipper ornament shaped like a star. They found no usable fingerprints and no genetic material capable of identifying who had handled the bag. Years of moisture, heat, and poor storage had destroyed almost everything that might have produced a conclusive result. The fabric could not explain where it had been discovered or how it had left police custody. For Linda Hensley, its return still carried meaning. She told reporters that seeing Tommy's initials reminded her that her son had existed, had touched that bag, and had left behind something time had failed to erase. For Vickers, the soil analysis became another reason to investigate his Southern Ridge theory. He believed the mineral composition resembled ground found in the hills beyond the original search boundary. He presented updated maps to the department and asked officers to conduct a new search. Investigators listened, documented his claims, and promised to examine the information. Eventually, the telephone calls stopped. The case remained officially active for less than a month. A small team reviewed photographs, interviewed surviving relatives, and compared the backpack with records from the original search. No new location could be established. Funding disappeared, media attention declined, and the investigation was once again classified as inactive. In December of 2008, the backpack was sealed inside protective material and returned to evidence storage with a new label. Ashland returned to its uneasy routine. The same streets remained, and many of the same residents continued driving past the place where the fire tower path had once begun. The sign was gone, and vegetation had nearly erased the trail. To people without a direct connection to the case, it became easier to treat the disappearance as a local ghost story. To those who remembered the boys' faces, it was never folklore. It was a piece of unfinished history. Harold Vickers continued hiking until age, and damaged knees made the journeys impossible. He remained certain that the missing evidence lay somewhere beyond the Southern Ridge. Linda continued placing toy soldiers near the old stump. When vandals damaged the site, she chose another nearby location and continued the ritual. The rest of Ashland waited without knowing exactly what was waiting for. Beyond the ridge, where old map lines no longer matched the land, the forest continued concealing whatever had happened. Then, in 2015, the Earth finally revealed a clue. Every case discussed on this channel requires extensive research, careful review, and long nights spent examining forgotten records. These stories deserve to be remembered, and the people at their center deserve more than a fading headline. To support more investigations like this one, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share the moment in this case that affected you most. Additional solved cold cases are available through the links in the description. Now, let us return to what happened in Ashland. By August of 2015, nearly 28 years had passed since the 4 boys vanished. Most residents rarely discuss the case openly. It had become an old tragedy remembered most strongly when July heat settled over the town and insects filled the woods with the same relentless sound heard during the summer of 1987. On a Saturday morning, a man named Daniel Merritt parked his pickup near the base of an isolated ridge west of Ashland. Merritt did not live in the town. He was a recreational hiker from Lexington who enjoyed exploring abandoned paths and forgotten logging routes. The ridge was not identified on most current hiking maps. Merritt had learned about it through an online discussion among people who explored remote terrain. Local residents referred to the area as the Limestone Cut. Decades earlier, loggers had used a steep route to move equipment, but erosion and unstable rock had made it dangerous. Few people visited willingly. Merritt had already been walking for several hours when he noticed a pale section of stone protruding from the hillside above him. The ground surrounding it looked recently disturbed, as though rain and erosion had caused part of the slope to fall away. He climbed carefully toward the exposed rock. Inside a narrow opening, he saw debris packed between broken slabs of limestone. Something among the stones appeared unnatural. It was a small metal container, heavily rusted and wedged tightly inside the hollow. Merritt nearly ignored it, assuming it was rubbish left by workers many years earlier. Curiosity eventually persuaded him to pull it free. The hinge broke when he attempted to open the lid. Inside, he found a folded notebook swollen with moisture and an old instant photograph whose image had almost disappeared. He gently wiped dirt from the photograph. For a moment, the faded picture became visible. It showed 4 boys standing together in front of a wooden sign. Although much of the lettering had deteriorated, 2 words could still be read: "End of trail." Merritt did not yet understand that the picture had apparently been taken 28 years earlier, on the same day Tommy, Jake, Mark, and Ricky disappeared. After returning home, Merritt described the discovery on the hiking forum. He included a photograph of the container and its contents. A local user recognized the style of the trail sign and shared the post with others. Within hours, the images had spread across social media. Eventually, they reached retired Deputy Harold Vickers. Vickers contacted former colleagues, and police spoke with Merritt the following morning. By that evening, uniformed officers had accompanied him back to the hillside. Investigators marked the location, established a restricted perimeter, and began photographing the area. Forensic technicians carefully collected the notebook, photograph, pieces of metal, and fragments of paper. Despite years of moisture exposure, portions of the notebook remained readable. Near the final pages, investigators found several lines written in smudged pencil. The message was uneven, but the words were clear enough to understand. It said they had followed the wrong ridge. Mark was injured. The daylight was gone. Whoever discovered the notebook should tell their mothers that they had remained together. The discovery transformed Ashland within 48 hours. Kentucky State Police requested specialists to determine whether the materials were genuine. Analysts studied the notebook paper, binding, ink, photograph, and metal corrosion. The paper and construction were consistent with products manufactured during the middle of the 1980s. The instant film material came from a production period that had ended before 1990. The corrosion and mineral deposits on the metal container were also consistent with decades of exposure inside the hillside. Investigators found no obvious sign that the discovery had been staged. The ridge was sealed, and a controlled excavation began. The work progressed slowly. Specialists used small tools, screens, and brushes to examine layers of compacted soil without damaging possible evidence. The first significant discovery was a small bone fragment. Then they uncovered part of a shoe sole with deteriorated fabric still attached. Nearby, they found a rusted buckle that might once have belonged to a backpack. Before the end of the week, the excavation revealed portions of 2 human skeletons beneath material deposited by an old rock slide. Forensic anthropologists determined that both individuals had been adolescent boys. Traditional dental comparison was difficult because of the condition of the remains, but mitochondrial genetic testing offered a stronger possibility. The first results were completed near the end of September. One set matched maternal relatives from Hensley family. The other matched the Porter family. Tommy and Jake had been found. News traveled through Ashland immediately. Television vehicles again filled the roads surrounding the sheriff's office. Reporters gathered outside, and families who had moved away began returning. After almost 3 decades of unanswered questions, the town was finally receiving confirmation that the boys had reached the southern ridge. Linda Hensley was 70 years old by then. She told a reporter that she had never expected to live long enough to see her son recovered. When asked how she felt, Linda struggled to answer. She described grief, relief, and a feeling she could not properly name. It was like finally being given the final pages of a book she had unknowingly continued reading for most of her life. The discovery site became the center of an expanded recovery mission. Specialists divided the ground into measured sections and documented every fragment of bone, fabric, metal, and personal property. The notebook was transported to a conservation laboratory. Experts separated pages that had fused together and used specialized imaging to reveal marks no longer visible to the unaided eye. They discovered partial sentences, lists of supplies, rough compass directions, and observations about the weather. One entry indicated that the boys believed the fire tower was somewhere east, but they could not locate it. The evidence increasingly suggested that the disappearance had not involved an attacker. The boys had become lost. They appear to have followed the wrong ridge into terrain missing from the maps used during the original search. Heavy rain and unstable limestone had then caused a collapse that buried the area. Investigators began reconstructing their final route. After leaving the recognized fire tower path, the boys probably followed an unmarked fire break south. They may have believed it provided a shorter route back toward Ashland. Instead, the path led into a valley several miles beyond the original search zone. When the rain arrived, the creek at the bottom of the valley would have risen quickly, cutting off the easiest return route. The steep sides of the basin became slippery, and the boys may have been unable to climb back toward the ridge. The notebook indicated that Mark had been hurt. With darkness approaching, the group apparently understood that they had traveled far beyond familiar ground. They placed their message inside the tin and secured it among the rocks, hoping another hiker or searcher would eventually find it. Forensic specialists believe the main slope collapsed sometime later, covering the trail and the area where Tommy and Jake were located. The same debris that concealed them also protected the notebook from being completely destroyed. The investigation was no longer treated as a possible homicide. Officials classified it as a historical recovery operation. The immediate objective was to locate all 4 boys and return them to their families. Search teams expanded across the ridge over the following weeks. Ground-penetrating radar was used to examine soil near the original collapse. Late one afternoon, the equipment detected a dense object approximately 30 yards farther down the slope. Excavators uncovered additional bone fragments belonging to at least one other person. Close to them was a small piece of metal shaped like a truck, possibly from a child's belt buckle. Genetic testing confirmed that the remains belonged to Ricky Cole. By the end of 2015, 3 boys had been identified. Mark Dalton had not yet been located, although investigators believed he remained somewhere within the same drainage system. Winter weather eventually made excavation impossible. Snow covered the ridge, and frozen ground forced officials to suspend the operation until warmer conditions returned. For the first time in 28 years, Ashland possessed real answers. They were painful answers, but they replaced decades of rumors and fear with physical evidence. People began leaving flowers, handwritten messages, toys, and photographs near the old trail entrance. Some residents said they could finally look toward the woods without imagining an unknown attacker. Others felt the forest had become even heavier now that they understood what had been hidden there. Harold Vickers visited the recovery site before the team departed for winter. He had spent half his life arguing that the boys traveled farther south than searchers believed. His theory had been correct. Vickers told a local journalist that the ridge seemed to have held the children for all those years, unwilling to release them until the right section of Earth finally moved. No one in Ashland knew whether to describe the discovery as closure, a miracle, or a tragedy delayed for almost 3 decades. One question stayed with everyone watching the recovery vehicles leave. What would have happened if Daniel Merritt had remained on the recognized trail? Had erosion not exposed the metal container, the truth might have stayed hidden indefinitely. The notebook had begun to answer where the boys went, but investigators still needed to determine exactly how the journey ended. Using modern geographic analysis, updated satellite images, the recovered writings, and the locations of the remains, authorities began retracing the final route. For almost 28 years, Ashland residents had relied on theories. Now forensic geographers and investigators could compare those theories against the landscape itself. The original maps from 1987 were placed across a conference table. They were marked with folds, stains, handwritten notes, and red lines showing every zone searched by volunteers. When experts compared them with modern geographic data, they identified a major problem. The map was inaccurate. During the years before the disappearance, flooding had damaged several old fire breaks and altered portions of the trail system. The printed maps still showed a southern branch connected to the Colton Fire Tower Trail. In reality, the original spur had been washed away in 1978. Sections of the old route remained visible on the ground, however, making it possible for someone carrying an outdated map or relying on local memory to believe the path was still safe. Investigators aligned modern satellite images with directions written in the notebook. The result changed their understanding of the entire case. The boys had not traveled west toward the fire tower, as search planners assumed. They had turned south, apparently believing they had found a shortcut home. That route led into an area known locally as Holler Bend, a complex landscape of sinkholes, narrow valleys, limestone channels, and ridges vulnerable to flash flooding. The reconstructed timeline revealed a frightening final journey. After leaving the main trail near evening, the boys probably descended into a steep valley. They may have followed the sound of moving water, believing it belonged to the creek near their neighborhood. As the sun disappeared, the vegetation became thicker and the ground more difficult. Somewhere during the descent, Mark was injured. Investigators believed he may have hurt his leg in a fall or become trapped briefly between rocks. The notebook entries reflected a gradual change from excitement to fear, followed by determination. There were simple sketches of trees, rough compass bearings, and repeated attempts to identify their route. One short line stated that they could not climb back up. Search teams in 1987 had stopped almost 2 miles north of that location. No one extended the operation farther south because the available maps suggested that no accessible route continued in that direction. In 2015, survey teams used aerial equipment to examine the hillside. A large section displayed the unmistakable shape of an old landslide, a smooth scar cutting across the slope where soil and rock had once broken away. Weather records showed that severe storms had struck the region during the period surrounding the disappearance. More than 5 inches of rain fell within approximately 48 hours. The unstable ridge may have collapsed while the boys were still sheltering below it. Investigators reached the painful conclusion that the friends survived long enough to experience the storm. Examination of the remains revealed injuries consistent with falling rocks and heavy debris. There was no evidence of weapons, deliberate violence, or an animal attack. Everything pointed toward the destructive force of a landslide. Authorities believe Tommy and Jake remained near Mark after he was injured. Ricky, the youngest and smallest, may have attempted to climb higher in search of help or a visible landmark. The surrounding terrain offered almost no reliable direction. Each ridge resembled the next, and the thick tree canopy prevented clear navigation by the sun. When heavy rain returned, the creek rose, and the slopes became even more unstable. The boys waited together. On one of the notebook's final pages, specialists found a nearly invisible reference to lightning. Infrared examination revealed part of a sentence describing flashes beyond the trees. It may have been written shortly before the slope failed. By the time organized search teams entered the forest the following morning, the section containing the boys had been altered by mud, rock, and fallen trees. The dogs that reacted near the old gully during the original investigation may have detected a faint scent carried from the slide area. Searchers did not understand that several tons of newly shifted material blocked the actual location. The clearer the reconstruction became, the more heartbreaking it appeared. The boys had stayed together. They rationed their supplies, tried to determine their direction, recorded changes in the weather, and left a message where they hoped it would be found. They had not failed to act sensibly. The failure came from inaccurate maps, unpredictable geography, violent weather, and an understandable decision to follow what looked like a recognized trail. Later in 2015, specially trained recovery dogs searched the lower creek bed about half a mile from the first excavation. The dogs repeatedly indicated an area covered by hardened sediment. After weeks of careful work, searchers uncovered remains belonging to 2 additional individuals. Genetic testing provided the final confirmation. They were Mark and Ricky. All 4 boys had now been recovered. The medical findings indicated exposure, dehydration, injuries caused by debris, and no evidence that any of them survived for an extended period. Investigators concluded that the friends died within several days of disappearing. For Linda and the other parents, the final report created a quiet form of closure. It could not erase their grief or restore the years they had lost. It did, however, give the story an ending based on evidence rather than speculation. Officials held a public briefing at the Boyd County Courthouse. Investigators explained how outdated maps, unrecorded terrain changes, and a major landslide had hidden the boys only a short distance beyond the original search boundary. They displayed the map used in 1987 beside a modern digital reconstruction. The difference shocked the audience. The ridge where the remains were found had not been correctly represented. What appeared on the old map to be an impassable slope was actually a gradual descent toward the Holler Bend Basin. The sheriff speaking at the briefing offered a statement that remained with Ashland. The children had not simply become lost. The search system had lost them. Residents cried as the briefing appeared on local television. The mystery that had haunted their community finally possessed a clear shape. There was no secret criminal, no hidden hermit, and no supernatural curse. There were 4 boys, a misleading trail, a damaged map, a violent storm, and a message written by frightened children who were still thinking about their mothers. Later that year, the remains were released to the families. Tommy, Jake, Mark, and Ricky were buried beside one another during a single ceremony attended by much of the community. Hundreds filled the small churchyard. Many had participated in the original search as teenagers or young adults. Now they stood with their own children, listening in silence. Harold Vickers remained near the back of the gathering with his hat held against his chest. For years, he had believed he personally failed the boys. As the ceremony ended, he quietly told a reporter that perhaps they had never disappeared completely. They had only been waiting for someone to finish telling their story. A soft rain fell over Ashland that evening. Beyond the ridge, insects hummed and water moved steadily through the creek that had concealed so much for so long. After 28 years, the truth was finally known. The investigation was closing, but a new chapter was beginning. Ashland would no longer remember Tommy, Jake, Mark, and Ricky only as the children who vanished. They would be remembered as 4 friends who refused to abandon one another. When autumn arrived in 2015, the silence over Ashland felt different. It was not the anxious quiet that had followed the community for decades. It was the calm that comes after a storm has finally passed. For almost 3 decades, the names of the boys had existed like an unfinished sentence. Now the town knew how the sentence ended. A public memorial was organized on a gray October afternoon in central Ashland. Rows of folding chairs covered the courthouse lawn. By midday, every seat was occupied, and hundreds more people stood behind them. Neighbors, retired deputies, former teachers, childhood classmates, volunteers, and families gathered shoulder to shoulder. Some had not spoken to one another in years, but all were connected by the same loss. Emergency sirens across the town were silenced for the ceremony. Only quiet conversation, wind, and occasional crying could be heard. On the stage, a state investigator unfolded a sheet of paper. He read a reconstructed version of the message preserved inside the notebook. The boys had written that they went down the wrong ridge. Mark was injured, and the sunlight had disappeared. They asked whoever found the message to tell their mothers that they had remained together. At the bottom of the page, conservators found one more faint line. The boys admitted they were frightened, but they repeated that no one had been left alone. As those words passed through the speakers, the mood of the crowd changed. It was not surprise. It was release. For years, the town had lived with suspicion, guilt, accusations, and fear. The truth was simpler and more painful than any rumor. The boys had not been abducted. They had not deliberately run away. They had become lost in dangerous terrain and remained beside one another until the end. Families who had once avoided each other reached across the rows and held hands. The uncertainty that had divided them gave way to shared grief. For the first time, the tragedy no longer seemed like a private burden carried separately by 4 families. It felt like something the entire town had survived together. The recovered notebook was later preserved inside a glass case at the Boyd County Heritage Museum. It was displayed open to the page containing the message. On the opposite page were simple drawings of trees, a rough map, and what appeared to be a sketch of a temporary shelter. Conservation specialists also recovered portions of personal notes. Tommy wrote that he had tried to keep everyone calm. A line attributed to Jake expressed the hope that they would see their families again. Museum staff said visitors often stood in front of the case for long periods without speaking. People left flowers, handwritten notes, toy cars, and small soldiers like those Linda had carried to the ridge each year. Some visitors traveled from other towns and states. Many had experienced the disappearance or death of a child in their own families. They found a small amount of comfort in knowing that the four boys had not faced their final hours alone. The Colton Fire Tower Trail was eventually reopened under a new name. It became the Four Pines Path. A wooden marker was placed at the entrance, dedicating the route to the missing children and to everyone who refused to stop searching for them. Each December, volunteers from Ashland High School placed 4 lanterns along the path, one for Tommy, one for Jake, one for Mark, and one for Ricky. Residents said the lights could be seen flickering toward the ridge where the trees opened and the sky became visible. Life never returned to what it had been before the summer of 1987. The families continued missing their sons, and no explanation could restore the years taken from them. Over time, however, the pain found a different balance. Linda Hensley said she never stopped thinking about Tommy. What changed was the dream that had disturbed her for decades. She no longer imagined him calling from a forest and waiting for someone to arrive. Her son was no longer missing. He was home. The woodlands surrounding Ashland changed in the town's imagination as well. For years, parents had described it as cursed and ordered their children to stay away. After the recovery, the fear slowly weakened. Hikers returned. Families walked the new path, and former volunteers visited the ridge to leave flowers. The forest was no longer treated as a place containing an unknown evil. People approached it with respect. The trees no longer seemed to whisper only of tragedy. They carried the memory of friendship, courage, and a promise kept under impossible circumstances. When wind moves through the hills, it creates strange sounds among the branches. Some residents say it is nothing more than wood creaking and water moving through the creek. Others believe they can hear distant laughter, soft and youthful, traveling between the trees. They imagine 4 friends riding into the hills on one final summer adventure. The boys did not return, but their story eventually did. For Ashland, that was enough to bring a measure of peace. Now, when visitors pass the wooden marker at the beginning of the Four Pines Path, they do not focus only on how the journey ended. They remember the message placed inside a rusted metal container by 4 frightened children. It was intended for their mothers, but decades later, it helped heal an entire community. They stayed together.